It gives me great pleasure this morning to be with you for this session, dear friends. And it's a continuation of Solace, where critical theories have been made easy. You would have been listening to a week session by elite erudite scholars of the different universities. I'm part of the session, and I take the privilege to present to you the gender studies, which is presented as a Revelation Explicit, and my thought process would be the interdisciplinary nature of gender studies. And pretty fine, basing the concept, first and foremost, I would love to tell you that it is a set of concepts and intellectual assumptions that we are going to talk about. So then we move forward for the next slide that comes across. Herein, you should know what are the objectives that we are going to decide upon before we complete the session. After 30 to 40 minutes, dear friends, we should know that you've been listening to me, and what would be the biggest benefit of you to have been here for the session. So we know that we analyze the major issues of what do we call as the gender studies, okay, and define gender, the different forms of gender. We take it in a cyclic rhythm as we are taking gender into an assumption of a thought process through literary study, and then we are going to make specific the different expressions related to the studies and focus on what do we call as the need for the gender studies and what would be the scope at the end of it, right? So we move on for the concept. To be very precise, you would have known what a literary theory is, right? To be very clear about it, a literary theory is a set of concepts and intellectual assumptions, as I've already told before. And you should know it helps a scholar to explain his work and writing to the text in relevance. So the literary theory becomes a critical theory, as we have to know the next move to the concept. It becomes a literary critical because it exposes and challenges the form of communication and the dominance of the writing through the field of social, explanatory, and as well as economic and political structures. We take gender studies as a social concept because verifying gender studies is a very important social field of understanding. We take it into economics because of the wide gap that is being between the genders, political of the racial differences, and the concern to say that women and men are having a bit of a difference in expressions, and there comes the political assumptions, right? So then this theory, we need to know, can be taken into three criteria of understanding. When it becomes critical, it is on explanatory note, precisely with the practical applications and normative forms. And with this understanding, we go forward with the different concepts of gender studies in brief. Okay, right? So what we aim at and what it represents, that is, as genders of the human race gathered here this day, let's get to know what would this critical theory represent. And we know this is again, what do we say, a social significance of the difference in sex, that it would represent, a gender. It can be taken as an elaborate social field encompassing the varied realms of society, in status quo to the biological rhythm. And most effectively, it is interpreted as a phenomenon of human characteristics, human behavior, and human expression. Gender transition between masculinity and femininity is of great concern to academic communities at this point of view. And we need to know this gender refers to a complex set of what do we say, characteristics and behavior that are prescribed for members of a particular sex category. Why do I say particular sex category? It varies from different parts of the world. That is the main concern, and if I would dwell deep into that, that the impact that it would create would take a long time. So we move across for the next concept taken for concern for discussion, what it depicts. Right? Nevertheless, you should know it is what the concern basically a field of academic study devoted to analyze the gender identity and gender representation. Representations can be in different form. It can be on terms of roles encompassing the identity, holding on with the identity, leading to gender expressions, and therefore leading to gender research. So then we should know it is a very fine field of social study and understanding, analyzing the social, cultural and psychological background with the biological setup of the gender of the society is important. When it comes to biological setup, the gender specifically harps upon the chromosomal combination of XX and XY, and where the dominance lies on this chromosomal integrity. Why is a female called the weak sex and why the male is said to be strong, is all that is what we call as a gender bias, but still it is part and parcel of this gender studies. And precisely to take note of examples, we have been discussing over a week. Many scholars have put forward their views and thoughts and theoretical interpretation with liberal humanism, Marxism, post-colonialism and eco-criticism and very many. And for me, gender studies also a part of an example of this criteria that we have taken into discussion. Okay, now we need to know how effectively this gender can be focused on as an important phenomenon, because I've already told you this particular phenomenon is undoubtedly is on the different sexes of the macrocosm. The earth is covered up with differential races, tribes and sets of people of human gender, of masculinity and femininity. So then what do we mean by that? Female gender, how it is culturally affected with the traditional values, the softness to entity, how delicate it is to be handled, while it has been formed, the female is said to be formed from the male complex identity from the ancient past, and how powerful the male character and the person is. In a literary writing, we would know who the protagonists and how it is of differential race, differential types through the races, I should say. Differential races will talk about the different kinds of people right around the world. And now we know with this understanding, we really have to know what would be the inclusions of this gender studies. Inclusions, what are the things that we are taking into concern? Male studies and female studies, or male writings and women studies. You should know how, and even queer studies comes into concern in gender writing. And you know, queer studies is such an important concept, wherein in this session I am not going to talk about queer studies, because it talks about the queerness of fiction, where there is that extreme entity of abnormal relationships or habits and values focused on, and the protagonists or the characters of a fiction will believe in that concept. It is more on to homosexual or lesbian or transgender deformities in terms of sexual impacts that they create or force on onto the society. So this is vibrantly a very large unit of understanding, which we shall do in the next session to follow up. But then this field is intricate. Why do I say intricate? Because it touches upon many delicate issues of the ecosystem, of the society, and writings of literature are focused to a large extent on this. Most of the writing of feminism or of the post-colonial or subaltern would have spoken about this kind of these inclusions, which talks about identity, roles and research leading to expression, or expression leading to research, vice versa. And such an expansive understanding we all need to take into concern when we are students of literature. Okay, so then having understood this, we move on with the next slide, and here we need to know how it goes on to tell us about the importance of the demarcation that we have to feel in gender studies, right? If it is taken as an hypothesis or a hypothetical analysis, there should be a demarcation of what is right and what is wrong, and where comes the difference in. So in such is the case, the line of demarcation, if it is to gender studies, would be more precisely on what is womenism and feminism. Both are not the same, though bit of integrated, interrelated, interdisciplinary applications. You need to know feminism is more towards family-oriented concern, a woman as such, in terms of the race, class and gender. That is feminism. But precise to feminism, it is again a bit to the fight or a claim for equality or equanimity in terms of the rights. And there comes what we call a complete concern on the gender. We can never say a woman is weak in the modern scenario, because it is again the dominance of the mental power that helps them to focus and get to concentrate at a higher establishments, right? So this understanding gives us a focus on the ideology of gender studies in clarity, which is that is very important, right? In consecutive terms, we go forward to understand this interrelated concepts. Having known what is feminism and womanism, when we talk about gender, we should know the simple thoughts in relation to gender roles, gender identity, gender expression, gender research, and that leading to feminism. Okay, now if I would talk about gender research, we need to know the range of behavior and attitudes of every gender that is possibly in a form in the society, right? So lead to many differential interpretations, if you would say. The basic dimensions of life is reflected in the roles that a man plays or the woman plays. What is the expected behavior of a man or a woman? How they have to be in a society. The specific rights and obligations play a major role. What is that individual self, right? It again surrounds on the attitude and the behavior of that particular gender. Feminine gender is completely different from a male gender. Why and how? And that is that based on the specific rights and obligations as expected of the society, and it varies between different races of the world. So gender roles play a major role. Like, coming in with gender identity, how come this gender identity would be an overlapping concept to gender roles? We need to understand. At times it get to be in contestant situation. It is contested, I should say, right? Categorically, it is contested because there are overlapping dimensions of issues of life, sex and reproduction. And there comes the identity. Where comes this reproduction? Which kind of gender identity is involved in that particular process? When gender is being biologically notified, where comes the difference? So then identity is based on social status, the kind of the person at the society, or the legal status, patriarchal or matriarchal inclinations within that, and the kind of the property assessment coming in with gender, and social interactions, and how a woman speaks and how a man speaks, how much of the addressing is being done to the society, and the interaction that dominates the culture of the workplace. That's important. But as a public personnel, all the top-notch people of the women and of the man are at that public personal exuberance. That's very, very important. So the personal experience and the psychological settings play a major role. And you should know the femaleness and the maleness is the major role of the gender identity, that is of main significance, which is a characteristic feature of any piece of a literary work. Moving forward, with a bit of a thought when it comes to identity, to the Stoic, very, very early female feminist who wanted to put forward a thought process, Simone de Beauvoir. And we need to know regarding gender, she says, one is not born a woman, one becomes one, right? Right means to say it is the habitual quality of the person, the kind of the quantifying attitudes of the person that makes you one of the femaleness. It's a very, very major issue, because in a female or in a male, both of them have a combination of identities. A man is not 100% man, 75% to 25% of womanism is there. Women qualities are there. And in a female, 80% of femaleness and 20% of ferociousness of that of the man's strength is personified there. So then it is related in reference to the lifestyle and the social and cultural construction. These constructs make a person a very strong identity in the society. So we need to know whether femininity or masculinity, it's a state of being, right? And the complete entity, it is a kind of a crux or a flux. We need to know why, because it is all time altering, all time changing, all time bringing in a kind of a thought process in terms of what we call as a protagonist getting to focus. If I would at this particular concept talk about the identity role or the research, gender research or gender expressions, as it would be in the writings of a very eminent Indian English writer, a woman writer, Kamala Das, leave alone all the prose forms, the sum total, poetic forms, the poetic forms, the sum total of the poetic form is an accumulation in her autobiography, the post writing, which is nothing else but a personal experience of a life. Right? Here the identity crisis against the social bias is very evident in all her expressions. It's a very strong expression. To understand her, we have to read twice the verse form or the poetic or the prose entities to make it viable. It means to say, and she clearly cuts through the focus to say that a female person, a female being is being exploited, but then there is the power of a femaleness which can create a kind of the research expansiveness. And the same will go in with the, what do we say, inequality of sexes. If I talk about gender research, it is an empirical knowledge where all the research will focus on the kind of the writing of the person, the discourses of the writer. English is basically filled in with such writings throughout. European writing for the white women was so dominant, followed in with black emphasis. There comes a mutual exchange between the identity of all the women races throughout. So the basic dimensions of the life, inclusive of care, love, sex and reproduction, is focused, and gets to know to say research is always a identity which can be calculated and analyzed, and it is contested. And you need to know inequality of sexes in the research or in expression was identified by Mary Wollstonecraft in her writing A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, a very earlier piece than even Simon de Beauvoir. And then here in these expressions, if I would talk about the kind of the masculine expression and female expression, even in our homes we do find how Dada will speak or how Mama speaks, and what kind of an integral differences it can be. How come of a soothing words of the mother and the strict stoic expression of the father. That is what the gender expression is. It is again on the behavior, mannerisms and the interest, language, and the language is used with the appearances which taken into concern of the nature of the person. So the particular cultural context specifically would tell us the category, the categorized way of expression of a female being and that of the male being. Here we can talk about the room of one's own, the writing by Virginia Woolf in 1929. She has got specific expressions to say. So then she is not very explicit a female feminist, though a very strong female writer, and she throughout in that writing The Room of One's Own, she advocated a balance between male self-realization and female self-annihilation. And problems faced by women were brought into focus here, and she advocates women to overcome the separate feminist consciousness to achieve femininity of the unconscious. So in order to overcome the conflict between male and female sexuality, Woolf's expression would have been from the consciousness to the unconscious, and how it can be one of a strong expression of a gynocriticism for which she has been very famous, right? So with this thought, we have come in with the understanding of the consecutive cyclic rhythm, and before going with feminism in precise, let me talk about this paradigm shift. There has always been many of the scholars prior to me who have spoke about paradigm shift. It's such a wonderful concept in literature, right? So then you should know many differential courses of study for which these gender studies is entangled. Areas of perpetual changes with nuances to a reality is the main focus in paradigm shift. We flow through the session in terms of the social norms, in terms of the political and economic, religious and diversified system, having gender differences throughout. So and then what does this paradigm shift lead to? Changes over years, over decades, a period of time, and taken as a profound thought of what we call as reality that exists, a paradigm shift. An existing thought or belief or way of life and yields to a newer version of the reality. What life was in the 19th century is what it is in the 21st century. We don't need to go back to 16th century. Let us harp on this particular period of time. Here again, the paradigm shift is again taken over. How in decades women have been treated and how they are in the modernity. So then we need to know that it is a multidisciplinary achievement. Paradigm shifts are powerful shifts. One's mind in the literature basing on gender roles and the reality of what a maleness and a femaleness, it is there. A women gender roles plays a major role in this paradigm shift and obtained through the consistent behavior of women and women's struggle against freedom. So now what has happened now? The women being badly affected from the past or even now at times, even now in this pandemic period, we see so much of discrimination and violence coming up, though at certain areas of reality, but then not very evidentially throughout the world. But it is a bit of a irksome and a cumbersome thought, is it not so? So what does this realms of gender tell us about? We need to know. As we are able to accept and understand the gender expressions, the realms of gender will always tell us a symbolic interaction. Maybe we can talk about a bit on the first wave, second wave and the third wave of originality of this feminism over here, where realms of gender leads into that particular understanding. We should know the first wave would have a kind of, thinking about women's equality, right, where gender identity was focused in. Domestic ideology, attitudes began to change in the first wave of the period of time when feminism was to be focused. Then in 1960, the second wave came in, feminist theory came into form evidentially with lot of expressions. Third wave, we had lot of emerged mid-90s ideologies where feminism became more international and it became multicultural and allowed more freedom on gender continuity. So it became a spectral effect, right? Emergence of the rights and right for freedom as against with the biological sex. You may be a man, you may be a female, woman, but still equality came in with the right to say I have the right to claim it, not to fight. I do feel that it's always fighting is not going to be an identity to be accepted. And we need to know that this realms of gender are a way of breaking down gender into different social, biological and cultural constructs, and which we have definitely referred as a focus in this gender studies even before. So then the hegemonic interaction comes in, the hierarchical dominance of a male and a female, the lineage of a man and women, gender bias, inequality, fighting for equity and equanimity. All these were some of the major concepts, and finalizing it through the advent of biological sequencing. Biological sequencing is naturally being born to be, right? So that is how. And here we can say that how Aristotle in 384 to 322 BC always felt that female is a female. That is a constraint of the surrounding reality ecosystem. And female, by virtue of a certain, he was very particular, they lacked certain qualities, and added that we should look upon a female as a state, or sometimes even took it as a deformity, which was accounted for the weakness of the physical form. But that was the old age reality. But now it has changed. There is supremacy of patriarchal over matriarchal rights. That was in Greek times, but now there is even matriarchal rights in dominance, right? Women is a misbegotten male according to Aquinas. So these are all the realms of identities that we can always talk. And right from Nietzsche to Freud, women were considered to be a bit inferior to male, right? So the sections of society which they took it as incapable of any serious thinking, but I don't think so. Along with the scholars, we have been some women trying to present our thought process to critical theory, and surmountingly it has become a success. And interpretations vivid and clear would make us understand that there is the maleness and femaleness, explicitly the femininity and the masculinity, but that is not all that it is privileged to be underestimated. It is developed along with the women's studies in a way to touch the world, to say that it is encompassing everything. I do say multidisciplinary because this gender study is related to many other courses of academic performances. No course, there are very many courses to relate it. For health study has got gender studies, biology has got a lot of health studies, literature has got a lot of gender studies, even people working for academic performances in administrative and explicit integrated civil services, they have to have evidences on this personal identity of what gender studies is. So validating or substantiating the view that it is interrelated subject and by itself. The multidisciplinary nature of gender studies tells that there are multidisciplinary nature of gender studies will always relate it with many other focused academic subjects and courses, right? So here in this slide, you can, when you're free, you can just go through the gender differences and disparity leading to inequality which has been developed over a period of time. But now we have overcome this scenario. We are able to try to be in the feminist consciousness and to become unconsciously strong about what our reality is. So this is a small gameplay that I have put forward for you to read through sometimes when you're free, my dear friends. So then taking into general gender theories, a few conflict theory, symbolic interaction theory, functionalism, and biological theory. We need to know that there is a lot of racialism, inequality, and feminism being personified over here. Feminism, liberal feminism into ideology, functional in terms of gender roles. So then these theories will give us an impetus to move forward in order to say that the concept of a woman, though very much hormonal, can also claim in for a liberation for the rights, and the differential treatment that has been given over a period of time can be overcome. And precisely this would lead to what we say the rights of establishment through the period of time. So we are not at the disadvantaged identity. We are at the advantage now because we work part and parcel with the men and make it an ecosystem of vibrance, right? Gender study is by and large feminism. We've come to the last part of the session here where we need to know that we don't have to take it as an antagonizing or a very rough entity of expression, but still an interdisciplinary approach to issues of equality and equity. When it is equanimity coming into concern, we take equity, which is based on the kind of the person we are, the gender, with the expression, identity, sex and sexuality playing a role, because all this have to be understood in a way of balance, right? So then we have narratives in feminism of activism, so which will have its own direct effect on the liberation for the rights. So many of the storylines of the ancient past of the women has come into literature, crossing over this identity specification. So differential areas has focused on women's status as against the men, and very evidentially we know from the mid-19th century we have theoretical negations and negotiations to the women's world, with many phases of feminism coming in, and already referred the first phase, second phase and the third phase into understanding, right? And who was the one who framed this name feminism? By Charles Fourier. an utopian scholar and a French philosopher who formed the name féminisme, which became feminism in English. So that was committed to change the attitudes and behavior. So it became a philosophy that holds with the ideal of equality. So the oppressed and the repressed people of the society, said to be the low categories, have fundamentally worked on for their rights of expression. Most probably in Europe, white feminism came into dominance, and which further led into black feminism, and then worldwide it moved as a wildfire. So then the metaphysical principles of understanding the concept of what feminism is, right? So then previously it was thought that men are the primary or the very first enemies of women, but that considerate misunderstanding has been overcome when women has emerged powerful and at the same time dangerous, because the female of the species sometimes tend to become dangerous, not in human identities. Maybe in some cases they go wild because of hormonal imbalance, but most probably if you take an in concern with animals, especially tigers and lions, they tend to become ferocious when the male doesn't go for hunt. It is the female that is. So the emerging women has a lofty and knowledge based pride was a very famous concept by our very fine superfine president of our times, and who has made it a fact to realize for the people around the world. So feminist theory is a focus in terms of power, in terms of politics, in terms of sexuality and cultural bias and social integration. So then it's a challenge to be very clear with inequalities women face even now, but still on the daily basis, but still we fight for in terms to overcome. So then comes empowerment, how my empowerment of my knowledge, my accusation or of knowledge, my impetus to educate myself is what has been my empowerment. So the rising the standards of women, improving the status of women in terms of training, literacy and education, allowing them to have self-determining decision-making ideologies and growing confident to solve problems by their own self is again a part of the society's integrity. So then gender studies explores issues of sexuality, power, marginalized population in literature and culture. Yes, very fine. If you would read very many concepts of feminism, you will know how gender appropriate behavior of both masculine and feminine beings is brought forward as the focus of understanding. And we know that there are phases in women's writing: feminine phase, feminist phase, as well as female phase. What do those phases tell us about? They tell us about the concepts of the 18th century right down to the present world, which tell that women have been given the identity, they have a content in the form of expression and a style, and that is how it has been. As an example, to conclude my explanations and discussions I've been carrying on, I bring forward a living writer, Sarah Makonza, and her very fine writing of her latest novel, What the Future Holds, is a very good example. Swaziland is such a small land in Africa. Since I've been working in Africa for 7 years, the Swaziland had a great force of attraction for me because of a friend who stays there. She's a professor in a university. This Sarah Makonza belongs to that land, and she works for pursuit of liberation. She works for women's rights, and she is again been very good editor and a writer, but she's been treated badly by our own people. So the modern world, she tries to say that every bit of what her writings would be on women empowerment, because she was a female journalist, and she wrote about the culture of women and how the existing pattern of lifestyle and tradition of the different tribes that she takes in. The existence of fact to realize on rights. She, as a famous critic for the government didn't like her. They tried to subdue her and put her in exile for some time, unless and until her own office was vandalized and she was destroyed. all her property was destroyed, but yet she fought for her right. She became a linguistic professor in an university. She worked abroad for some time, and she formed an association for African women. An African book fund group is available, made it possible in Michigan. And you know, even now, African continent gets, every country of Africa, 54 countries, get thousands and thousands of books from European nations. That is how Sarah Makanza has initiated that move. Okay, right? She's such a great living writer, and she teaches courses in Zulu and Xhosa, and it is language of one of the tribes in Africa in Stanford University. And such a pleasure you can talk to her too, to talk about women empowerment. The story Women, a book, What Future Holds. I've just taken a small bit of that instance of a gender identity there. The Future Holds has got the story about a lady called Kiki, and this Kiki, a young Swazi woman of Guni type, and she is the main protagonist there. She, as an youngster, lost her parents, but she was cheated by a man, and she begot a child. And the father, Menzi Damini, leaves her and says, no more, I can have you. Because in Africa, the tribal culture and the people life is completely different from what we are. Here, our parents find a boy to live with and to get us married to, in most of the cases, unless the girl takes a chance to choose a boy. But there in Africa, no, it is they have to choose. So then many a times they beget children even before marriage. So such is the case. Then she had to struggle herself to bring up the child. And this particular situation in this paragraph, she comes in search of the father, trying to claim some money to take it as a child support. Here you know the crisis, the gender crisis. One identity. This story goes on for a long run. What the future holds. If you're free or good enough or able to get it in Amazon, try to get it. There's another book called Deflowered by Kafula Mawile Pamela, an African writer, Zambian writer. Even that is very awesome. How was an young girl, she was cheated, and how she got deflowered. I don't need to tell you the meaning of it and how the life goes on. Every story in Africa is very interesting because it's a real life experience of a woman, and there comes feminism. So then it's got nothing to do with belittling men, my dear friends and all the scholars. Nevertheless, it works towards equality and not female superiority. So yet the female of the species is strong and unique. So I thank you in immense for having given an opportunity to address on gender studies. Hope to see you no sooner in another form, in another chapter, another version. Thanks to all the scholars, and this session I dedicate to all the erudite professors of the microcosm. Thank you so much.